The reigns of King Richard and King John covers a period of 27 years from 1189 to 1216. Through inheritance and marriage, their father Henry II had ruled a huge empire that stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees. He controlled the western part of France and, in fact, controlled more of France than the King of France. Richard inherited these lands on Henry's death, but by the time John died in 1216, his son Henry III inherited just a small part of southwestern France. The brothers in turn each ruled mainly agrarian societies with few large towns and cities. Life for most people under Richard and John consisted of working on the land for their feudal lord, with the main differences between them being the climate and the crops they grew, from growing barley, oats and wheat in the fields of cold and wet northern England to grapes in the vineyards of hot and humid southern France. Those who lived in towns and cities were free men, owing no duty to a feudal lord and living by manufacturing and trade. A feature of the period was the growth in both the prosperity and the numbers of towns. Richard and John governed their realm by dividing it up amongst their great men, barons who in return provided the king with knights and taxes when required. They in turn granted lands to knights who would pay taxes to the baron, as well as bringing themselves and men from their lands to fight for the king when asked. At the bottom were the peasants, who actually did all the farm work to provide food for everyone above them in the feudal system. While Richard and John held absolute political power over their realm, they had to deal with an alternative power base in medieval Europe, the Catholic Church, of which almost everyone was a member. The Pope, who lived in Rome, was the spiritual leader of Western Europe and claimed leadership of all Christians. Just as kings divided their lands amongst barons, the Pope appointed bishops and archbishops to administer the church in different areas of each country, although kings often tried to interfere and even take over the process. All medieval kings needed to ensure they kept on good terms with the Pope and the Church. While they often argued with the Pope, most kings were still devoutly Catholic, and while a king's main job was to control his powerful and ambitious nobles and protect his realm from threats from neighbouring kings, Richard's religious faith was best demonstrated by his determination to go on crusade to bring Jerusalem back under Christian control. In his 10-year reign from 1189 to 1199, Richard spent barely 6 months in England, spending 3 years on crusade and then being held captive for over a year on his return by the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI, who demanded a huge ransom to allow Richard to continue on his journey home. With Richard being held in captivity, King Philip of France, supported by Richard's brother John, had begun to take over Richard's possessions in France. Richard sent him a message on being released that said, "Look to yourself, the devil is loose." For the next 5 years, Richard devoted himself to restoring his control of the Angevin Empire he had inherited from his father, and had all but accomplished his aims when he was killed while besieging the castle of Châlus-Chabrol in the Limousin in central France. Riding close to the castle walls at dusk, he was hit in the shoulder by a crossbow bolt fired by one of the castle defenders, and the wound turned gangrenous. He died 11 days later and was succeeded as king by John. While Richard is remembered as one of England's great kings, John is remembered as probably the worst. Under the rule of primogeniture, he shouldn't even have been king. John was Richard's youngest brother, but they had another brother, Geoffrey, who was older than John and had died before Richard became king. His 12-year-old son, Arthur of Brittany, should have come before John in line to the throne, but Richard proclaimed John his heir on his deathbed, fearing Arthur was too young. Aware that Arthur had a stronger claim to the throne, John had him imprisoned and probably killed, his body being found floated in the River Seine in 1203. John had none of his brother's military prowess, or his authority, strength and charisma, and totally alienated most of his powerful French barons, who quickly began to switch their loyalty to Philip. As he lost his lands in France, John fled to England, where he immediately began taxing his subjects heavily to pay for a campaign to regain the territory he had lost. He proved no match for Philip on the battlefield and returned humiliated to England in 1204. John's troubles with the barons broke out into open warfare, which led to him being forced to agree to Magna Carta in 1215. It guaranteed the rights of free men to not be imprisoned without a fair trial, prevented the king raising taxation without the agreement of the barons, and prevented John from interfering with the church. The Pope immediately told John he did not have to stick to the agreement, but Magna Carta had far-reaching consequences for England's kings for the next 500 years. For the first time, there were legal limits to their power. John went to war with his barons again in 1216, and Prince Louis, the oldest son of King Philip of France, led an invasion force in support of the barons who had promised to make him king instead. John died in Newark Castle in Nottinghamshire in 1216 after falling ill on campaign. The barons then had his young son Henry crowned as king, and Louis was forced to go back to France. The period between the coronation of Richard and the death of John saw huge political changes. The king could no longer govern as he pleased, and Magna Carta had set in motion a process that would lead to the development of Parliament. Henry II's empire was gone, and the English monarchy had lost almost all of its French possessions. It wasn't the end of England's involvement there, but it would be almost 150 years before an English king would again control so much land in France.